Well, hey, if we haven't met yet, my name is Mark, and so glad that you're here. And let me join my welcome with all the welcomes you've already got and just extend that same sentiment that this Sunday is the perfect Sunday if it's your first Sunday. We're starting a brand new series today called My Problem with God, and it's basically a bunch of questions that we have that we wrestle with, that if we could ask God a question, or if we believed in God, we'd ask him this question. It's a 6-week series based on that. And so that means if you're kind of skeptical, if you're kind of like, I'm not sure if church, faith, religion is for me, this is the perfect Sunday. But if you're like, no, I'm a church person, this is for you too, because let's be honest, we all have questions. I feel like some days I'm one of the biggest skeptics in the world about faith. I just wrestle with these things on and on and on all the time, and Lakeside's a perfect place for you to be because we're just continually wrestling and wanting to figure out more and more of our faith as we discover the God that we worship. So wherever you came from, whoever invited you, we're so glad that you're here. And in this series, we're going to tackle 6 of those big problems that often you hear when people say, you believe in God? Here's why I never could, or I believe in God, but I don't believe he's good, or I don't believe he's loving, or I believe he started the world and he just kind of set it in motion and walked away. And so here are the things that we're going to cover in this series. Week 1, which is this week, which is God's existence. Some people, it's like the problem stops there. It's like, I don't believe he exists. That's my only problem. After that, I have nothing else to say to him. Others, it's science. It's like, hasn't science already proved God doesn't exist? How can you have science and faith in the same conversation? And maybe your challenge was like, I feel like if I'm going to be a Jesus person, I have to check my education at the door. We're going to tackle that question next week. The next week, maybe you're like, no, I think there's a God out there. I think there might be something beyond us, but like the Bible seems to be thousands of years old. It seems to be outdated. It seems to be full of contradictions. How do you deal with all that? Great questions. Number 4, week 4, really excited about this one. This is probably one of the biggest questions. If there's a God, and if he's good, and if he's all powerful, why is there evil and suffering in the world? We're going to tackle that question. Number 5, problem with sex. Some of you are like, I believe in God. I just don't like the way he seems to think about relationships and sex, so I don't have anything to do with him. That's going to be a great week to come. And then week 6, we're going to talk about hypocrisy and exclusivity. So super excited about that. And we really at Lakeside just love asking questions. We love wrestling. We think it's actually a Jesus thing. Some of you maybe grew up in a home where you were just told, just have more faith, or you don't ask God questions. I just got to be honest and say those are just lies. That nowhere in the scriptures will you find that. In fact, you find the opposite. I tell the story all the time. You find Thomas, who Jesus didn't give him this nickname, but all his friends did. It was Doubting Thomas. Maybe you've heard that. Maybe you're not even a church person. You're like, I've heard that phrase, but I don't even know where it's from. It's from the Bible. One of Jesus' disciples, Thomas, asked a question. When Jesus rose from the dead, he's like, is it really you? Now, doesn't that just suck? I mean, the guy asked one question, and now for thousands of years, his track record is, you're doubting Thomas, right? The other day, I'm driving in my car, and my wife and I are having a disagreement. Like small, like not fighting or anything. We don't do that. But like a little disagreement, and she probably started, I'm sure, right? But anyways, so we're going back and forth, All of a sudden, my 4-year-old's like, don't be a doubting Thomas, just trust in his promise. And I'm like, what? Where did you learn that? And why? Poor Thomas, 2,000 years later, the dude asked one question and now he's screwed, right? Like, why is that his legacy? You know what's amazing, though, is that when you look at that story, Jesus didn't give him that nickname. While everybody else was standing back judging him for questioning Jesus, Jesus was like, he didn't say, come on, Thomas, just have more faith. Come on, smarten up. Come on, you don't question God. He's like, come here. Look at this evidence. Stick your finger in the hand where the nails went. That's the posture of Jesus, that he doesn't just say, come on, just have more faith, or come on, just believe, or you don't ask questions of God. Not at all what Jesus said. In fact, what did Jesus say? He said, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That faith is not an intellect left at the door kind of adventure, but it actually, we bring all of us to it. That God's not scared of our questions. He's not scared of our skepticism. He's not worried about anything. And at Lakeside, we're not either. And so if you're kind of in that category, you're like, I'm not sure I believe. I've been wrestling. I have questions. It's like, join the club. We all do. And we're just so glad you're here. We like to say, you don't have to believe to belong. And we got that from Jesus. Jesus was constantly surrounded by people who didn't quite believe, who were asking questions, who were wrestling, who at times would be like, I don't know if I can be, and if that's what you believe, and kind of tap out and then come back. And it's just amazing. That's the Jesus way, and so we're so glad that you're here joining with us. And as we get into this series, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you ordered something online? Maybe I should start with that question. Okay, order something online. Okay, a few of you have. Come on, be honest. Okay, good. All right, good. So you ordered some things online. Wow, bravo. Welcome to the 21st century. Okay. Now, have you ever had that moment, though, where you realize you get the notification, it's like the package is arriving today, and you're like, I'm not going to be home for a few hours. And you kind of realize in that moment that someone's going to see the package before you. It might be a roommate, a neighbor, a spouse, a grandparent, a child. Somebody is going to see that package outside your door, and then they're going to ask you this question like, seriously? Another tablet? Seriously? Another pair of shoes? Seriously? A 9th fishing rod? Really? Like, did you need another one? And in that moment, you realize you're gonna have to justify this purchase. And so you go online, and you go to the website, and you click on the 5-star review tab. You ever done that? And you just read all the 5-star reviews, and you just look for all the reasons why this is the best fishing rod ever, and you need it. These are the best shoes ever. They look good, but they're waterproof, they're functional, and they're sexy, right? Like, you have to figure it out, because when they ask you, like, another one, you're like, no, let me tell you, I had to. It's so good. I had this experience recently. It was my son's birthday, and we were thinking, we kind of got together with the grandparents, like, hey, let's pool together, and let's get a trampoline. And so then I'm kind of online looking for a trampoline, and I kind of find this generic one. Then I'm reading reviews, and it's like, reading all these statistics about kids ending up in the ER with trampolines and all that. And so I'm like, oh man, I can't get my kids one of those ones. I need to get one of the really bougie ones, right? Like the ones that are like totally safe. You can't hit your head on it because the metal's hidden and all that. And so anyways, I'm like, I can't afford that. It's like thousands of dollars. I find one on Kijiji that's a little bit of rough shape for $70. So I call my buddy Robert, and I'm like, Robert, want to go for a drive to Kitchener? And we drive to Kitchener, and I mean, it was rough. It was rough, okay? And so I get it home, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna need a new net, so price that out. Okay, that's a little bit expensive. And then, okay, like, do we have to cover the fiberglass rods, or can we just tell the kids not to touch it? Because, like, babe, no, okay, fine, we're getting this another $100 for the 90 rods, like, just kind of going through it. Now the price is getting higher and higher, and I'm just like, 5-star reviews. And I started reading, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, it's the best, it's the safe, and just kind of do that, right? And then all of a sudden, months later, our kids are loving the trampoline, I'm loving the trampoline, I've sewed up some of the edges because those were frayed, and I didn't want to buy that part because that part was really expensive, so I've sewed it, and all that stuff. And I'm at a friend's house, and he has the same trampoline. I'm like, you got the safe trampoline too, this is like the best. And he's like, really? He's like, I was jumping around the other day, and I smashed my head on that bar that's supposed to be covered. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to a 1-star review. How did you get into my life? I only want the 5-star reviews, man. Like, why is this happening? But isn't it true that there's something in us that sometimes does that, right? It's called confirmation bias, if you talk to psychologists. It's we gather evidence that confirms the views and prejudice that we'd like to be true. Right? It's like sometimes we're hook, line, and sinker in. We signed up for that degree. It's like people don't even need it anymore, but it's like, no, it's going to be good. It's going to come back. Or people really need this. It's really important. It's just like you've already paid for it. You've already bought in. You've already joined the club. You've already got the membership. You've already showed up every single Sunday for the last 20 years of your life. This better be true, because that's a lot of sleeping in that could have happened that you didn't get, right? Like we've all had that moment where we realize if we're gut level honest, there's a bit of confirmation bias going on, right? Where it's just like, I just need to back up my views a little bit. And if we're honest, as Jesus people, I think there are times where we're kind of guilty of this. There are times where we just kind of want to read the things that affirm what we agree with. We don't really want to get into discussions who don't agree with it, because sometimes it just feels like we're a few questions away from losing our faith. We're a few challenges away from like, oh, I'm not sure. And so the whole point of this series for the Jesus people is to really wrestle with our faith, because I believe as we wrestle with it and as we test it, we actually grow in greater understanding of who God is, and we grow in intimacy with him. So that's super important. Now, if you're here today and it's like you got invited or you showed up and you're not quite sure and you have questions, you're like, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, or agnostic, I'm not sure if anything can be known in the world, or you're the SB and R category, spiritual but not religious, that's your checkbox in the government forms, or you're just like, I just don't care. This series is kind of like reading the 1-star reviews for you, okay? It's kind of the stepping out and just saying like, okay, I'm open to this. Let's just dialogue, and that's what I kind of would invite you to do over this series. And here's kind of our mantra for the series, okay? I think this is a great thing for life, which is simply this. Follow where the evidence leads, not where we hope it leads. Let's follow where the evidence leads, not where we hope it leads. And that's the journey that we're going to go on over the next few weeks. And so today we're going to start with the first question, which is simply this. Why would anyone believe that God is real? Why would anyone believe that God is real? And I've had so many conversations with people. They find out I'm a pastor. It's like, oh, like you believe in God. And then I usually hear some sort of format of this, and it just kind of feels like it's like, why would you believe that? Like education has brought us further. Science has brought us further. And as I talk more and more, I kind of get this feeling that they have this idea that Jesus people are like Ned Flanders. We're a little bit socially awkward, we're uneducated, we're ignorant, we have our head in the sand, and we're just kind of like, la, 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 right? Like, just don't want to know, right? Don't ask me too many questions. And it's shocking to me because I grew up in a family where we weren't always Christians. My parents are from Quebec. When they moved to Ontario, they actually heard some stories of people who've met Jesus and actually became Jesus followers. And so I started going to church when I was born because they became Jesus followers just before I was born. So I kind of got to grow up with parents who were just figuring out what it meant to follow Jesus, and it was really neat. And one of the things that was really fascinating was the church that I was at had nothing, didn't have the Ned Flanders effect. I was regularly interacting with biologists and doctors and med school professionals, and med school professors and professionals and all these kinds of people who were excellent at their field and yet had faith in God. And their faith in God was not in spite of their education and their intellect, it was actually the reason for it. And that was fascinating to me because as I talked with more and more people, what I realized was so many people were aware of stories of people who had left the faith because they had learned something, and they were not aware of anybody who had ever joined the faith because of rationale and reason and science. And so today what I want to do is kind of open our eyes to some of the other perspectives and other views of people who've actually maybe taken that journey. One of them is Anthony Flew. Anthony was Oxford professor. He was an atheist, and you could still find, videos of him on YouTube in the 90s arguing with Christians about why belief in God was dumb for all these psychological and scientific and philosophical reasons. Like, he was a brilliant mind. And then eventually in his life, he kind of reached this place in I think it was 2004, where he basically said atheism is no longer a logical, tenable, or defensible position to hold. And when asked about it, he said, I was just continuing on my life quest to follow where the evidence leads. And Anthony Flew, before he died, actually wrote a book called There Is a God, explaining his quest, going from a staunch atheist to now a believer in God. And I think his journey kind of stopped at there is a God, or I believe there's a God, and didn't quite go into, can we know this God? Is it a personal God? But that's where his journey led him. That was the quest that he was on. And if I'm honest, this is how much of a skeptic I am. I hear that story and I'm like, I know how the Christian marketing machine works, and I just have to wonder if he kind of reached near the end of his life and was wondering if he was maybe running out of retirement savings. And it was kind of like, I bet if I write a book as one of the most famous atheists and I say I've become a Christian, I bet the Christians would buy my book like crazy. That's the skeptic in me, okay? But anyways, the amazing thing is it's not the case. And in fact, there's just so many stories of people who've done the exact same journey. And I'll give you a few of their names and some of the books that they've written just kind of as a resource as we go through this series. Because here's the bottom line of this series. In no way are you going to reach the end of the 35 minutes after each week's message and think, there it is, never have another question again. That was the nail in the coffin, okay? I don't want this to be this big sage from the stage. Think of me as a guide from the side, leading you through, serving up. Why is that so funny? Well, that's rude. And serving up appetizers for thought so that you continue to wrestle through those questions. And some of these books will be really, really helpful for you. Here's one I love. You notice the title sounds a lot like ours. I actually love Mark Clark's book called The Problem of God. And so My Problem with God, we actually leverage some of the ways that he maps it out. By no means is Mark the first person to write on this, okay? Mark grew up in an atheist family, was an atheist for a long time in his life. And as he began to explore, he actually became a Christian. Now he's a pastor. And he wrote The Problem of God. And the thing I love about this book is that it's super understandable. He takes things like some of these concepts and some of the authors, they're brilliant, but you just can't have coffee with them. It's like you're talking with them and I'm just gonna take a nap. Mark Clark just puts it on the bottom shelf. He makes it accessible for everyone. You can even audiobook this book. It's that good, okay? Next one I recommend is Tim Keller. Tim Keller is a Jedi. He's a pastor up in Manhattan, speaking to the 1%, okay? Some of the smartest, most powerful people in the world, some of them go to Tim Keller's church. And he writes The Reason for God, okay? Reason for God's another great one, and as you read that one, if you just want to keep digging, just look through the bibliography, and then you just find more and more books, people who believe, people who don't believe. You'll just continue to be taken on a journey. I have to warn you, this one's a little heavier, okay? I don't recommend trying to dig out a trench for the plumbing in your basement bathroom that you're installing while listening to this book, because every 30 seconds you're gonna have to stop, climb out of the hole, and take a note. Just speaking from personal experience. Okay, I just felt I needed to warn you about that. Okay, so audible, no thanks. Okay, great. Next one, C.S. Lewis. CS stands for Clive Staples Lewis. Doesn't that sound like a guy you want doing your accounting? Clive Staples, yeah. He's nailed it. Anyways, C.S. Lewis, brilliant guy, also grew up an atheist, Oxford professor. He's the author of the Narnia series, if you know that, and many other books. One of my favorites that he wrote is Mere Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, he unpacks his journey because his was an intellectual journey. He says it was an intellectual journey, wrestling with things I believed. It was chatting with my friend J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, till like 3 a.m., just wrestling with this idea of faith. He's kind of going through it over and over, trying to make sense of it all. And in Mere Christianity, it's actually a recording of lectures that he gave over the radio waves on the BBC in the time when bombs were being dropped by the Nazis over London. C.S. Lewis was the dude that they invited to speak hope and answer some of the questions that people were wrestling with. There's no fluff in this book. C.S. Lewis just lays out what led him to become a Christian. And I love the way he describes the way he became a Christian. This is what he says about himself. I was the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. He's like, I didn't want to become a Jesus follower at first, but I was just following where the evidence led, and it led me to this place where I became a Jesus person. So C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity is a great book. And so today what I want to do is very quickly scrape the surface. I want to just give you 2 of the areas where we find clues that help us understand and give us a lens into some of these people's worlds who've actually moved to a belief in God from unbelief in God. And we're going to go through 2 of them. There's probably 24 different arguments or proofs or clues for the existence of God. Today we're going to cover 2 of them. And the first one is moral clues. Sorry, I'm fighting something, so I might go through that. That's not good. Oh, dear. Moral clues. About a year ago, I was driving with what's now my 4- and 2-year-old. It was a 3- and 1-year-old. And I don't remember why, but for some reason, I got my son, the 3-year-old, a Timbit. And so I just kind of like sneakily just handed it to him thinking like, enjoy this, don't let your 12-month-old sister see it, right? And immediately, what was supposed to be discreet, I hear this screaming, which is, why Kaya no get a Timbit? And I'm like, are you kidding me right now? You're worried about being fair? Can I just be honest? Sometimes pastors have bad thoughts, but I'm just like, in my head, didn't say it out loud, but I'm like, shut up and eat your Timbit. Like, why is this an issue? Like, why are you worried about being fair? And then as I wrestle with that, I'm like, why is fair even a category that comes up? Like, why is that something that you're worried about? Why are morals, why is it that you have that? And I love C.S. Lewis. He lays this out in his book. It was part of his quest that he was wrestling with, trying to figure out the world. He says, we all have moral statements like this. How would you like it if I did that to you? You've heard toddlers say that. You've heard adults say that. That's my seat. I was there first. Come on. You promised. And he has more. Can you share some of yours? I shared some of mine. Leave him alone. He wasn't bothering you. We all have these moral statements that we just throw out there, whether we're old or young, educated, uneducated. We all seem to have this thing within us that tells us that there is right and wrong in the world, which brings us to the first clue, which is a question, which is this: why are we moral creatures? Why are we moral creatures? Leo Labresco, who's a famous atheist blogger, actually describes this question as the first step on her journey to becoming a Christ follower. It was wrestling with this question because she's like, I can't make sense of this. Why are we moral creatures? How do we have this built into us? Because it seems like everybody you talk to has a sense of morals. Even mob bosses who do horrible things, and you should trust me because I've watched lots of mob documentaries in my bubble bath times, okay? They do terrible things, and they even have morals, right? You don't betray the mob boss, and you don't mess with his mom. They have morals too, right? Everybody seems to have morals that are laid out intrinsically inside of us. Everybody believes that betrayal is wrong. Everybody believes that lying and theft is wrong. Everybody except Quebecers thinks that you should signal when you change lanes, right? My people, they're just a little bit behind, right? But it's like, everybody has that. I remember my professor in first year philosophy, he's like, if anybody ever tells you that we don't have intrinsic morals, that we don't have this belief that's right and wrong, he's like, this was his solution. I don't suggest it, but he's like, punch them in the face, take their jacket, and see if they try and question you on that. Right? Because everyone believes that theft is wrong. Everyone believes you shouldn't take from, you shouldn't betray, you shouldn't lie. There's something in us that seems to be what we would call objective moral values. They're just there. Wherever you go in the world, they're there and they're valuable. And some of you are like, yeah, but there's some people, and we've heard of them, we've seen them on the news, that don't seem to have those values. And it's like, you're right, but what do we say about them? We don't just say, well, they have a difference of opinion. No, we say, they're sick, they're twisted, there's something wrong. Because every single one of us, and this is what C.S. Lewis was noticing, this is what I'm noticing, my toddler with the Timbit, is that everybody has intrinsic moral values that are just there. And we're, oh, thank you. Everybody give it up for Ed. Oh, that's so good. That where do they come from? And that's not to say that there isn't an explanation without God. There is an explanation. It would be the naturalistic evolutionary explanation, which would say the way we got our morals is basically the decisions that we made as animals, which was survival of the fittest, right? To protect and to procreate. So whatever things would move us towards that, that's what kind of built our morals. And it just kind of goes back to the animal world, which I can get. If you've ever been at Yorkdale Mall on Boxing Day and you're trying to get a parking spot, I see those animal tendencies. You ever hung out with two toddlers trying to get one remote? I see those animalistic tendencies. I get that. And yet the reality is while that can explain some of it, it has some problems. Some of you were around in 1997 when there was a big headline. It was titled in some ways The Prom Mom. It was a young lady named Melissa Drexler. And she was a young woman who got pregnant, and on the night of her prom, she had hid it from everybody and actually ended up delivering the baby in a bathroom stall and then putting it in a bag and dumping it in the garbage and left it for a janitor to find. And this just shocked America. Like, people were just, it was headlines. People were appalled. They couldn't believe that this had happened. And then I think it was a few days later, there was a New York Times article by a man named Steven Pinker. And he wrote an article that was, I think it was titled, I just read it last week, I think it was titled, Why They Killed Their Newborns, Why Mothers Kill Their Newborns. And he basically, in this article, just laid out the fact, he said, this shouldn't baffle us. This shouldn't bother us. This is just what mothers have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. This is just survival of the fittest. That for hundreds of thousands of years, mothers in areas where there was a lack of food had to decide if this child lives, then the others may starve, so we just get rid of it. And that would just happen. There's history recording it. He said, this isn't normal. We shouldn't look down on her. She was a teen mom. It would have been hard to raise a child, and the stigmas in our society. She was just protecting it. So don't look down. Don't be baffled by this. This is just part of nature. This isn't a bad thing. And I read the article, I'm like, there's some interesting points in this. And yet there's a part of you, if you're gut level honest, is just sick as you hear that. There's a part of you that is just like, okay, that's a fair explanation, and yet you're just thinking, if I'm looking for a babysitter, Mr. Pinker, the guy who wrote this article, is not my first choice. Like, he's not the guy I want, because something in the core of every person in this room, whatever you believe, is disgusted by that. Because there's something intrinsic that we know should not be happening. But then beyond that, there's actually an even bigger problem. Beyond the fact that every single one of us is like, no, there's something in me that I feel was born in me, and if I go across the world, they will feel the exact same thing at that narrative. There's a bigger problem that goes beyond that, which is the idea of altruism. Altruism is the idea of when we serve others at our own expense. And altruism is really interesting, because when you talk about this, it's just survival of the fittest, and we do things so that we can procreate and protect ourselves and all that stuff. It's like, then how do you explain this thing inside of us that says it is good to serve others at our own expense? How do we explain the fact that every culture in the world takes notice of a life given on behalf of another? That I love what Tim Keller says. He says this very simply when referring to altruism. He says, how could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? It doesn't make any sense. That there are things that are intrinsic within us, like the sense of altruism, that we were meant to serve others at a cost to ourselves, that never would have survived, that never would have made it. If there were tribes and cultures that were okay with that, they would have just ceased to exist, unless it was put in there by another way. That the thing that we should value, if it really is survival of the fittest, the things that we should have evolved with, the things that help you survive when the going gets tough, is lying, betrayal, backstabbing, and disloyalty. Those should be things that we value, because we've all been in a place where we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and we just think, if I just lied, if I was willing to get rid of this friendship, if I was willing to ruin this marriage for the sake of this, or to sleep with her, or to sleep with him, I would just do it. Everything would be better. That's the survival of the fittest. But those aren't values that we value. And so all of a sudden, people are wrestling with these morals, and it's like, where do they come from? Because the naturalistic evolutionary explanation actually doesn't make sense with regards to this. In fact, Dawkins was once asked, he's the God Delusion author, he was once asked, he's like, so if you believe this, you're married. Why have you chosen to be faithful to your spouse? Because that's not an animal tendency, right? Man's best friend, you ever been to the dog park? Loyal is not the first word that comes to mind. It's like anything that moves and some things that don't, right? And so it's like, so Dawkins, why are you faithful to your wife? Like the Darwin evolutionary theory says that you just should have evolved and it's all about procreation and protection. And this is his response. I'm making an un-Darwinian decision. That it starts to break down eventually. Because you start to realize that the branch that you're sitting on actually falls apart when you say, we just evolved this way. It's like, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't evolve, you wouldn't have survived. Those values wouldn't be in us, but they're in every single one of us. Where did that come from? That there needs to be somewhere where this actually came from. The scriptures have a better idea. We can go up one more. This is the question. If there's no moral force behind the universe, why are we moral creatures? That's what we have to wrestle with. When we're wrestling with beginnings and where did we come from, we have to wrestle with this question because we can't make sense of it without a God. In Romans 2:15, I love what it says. It says, the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. It says we're made in the image of God, that God stitched this into our being, that there are certain things that everybody knows they're in the core, they're imprinted at the core of our being. They go against the animalistic tendencies out there. This is the way God designed and created us. This is how we were created. That you have to come back to this question with the moral clues. If there's no moral force behind the universe, why are we moral creatures? But if there is a God, then it makes sense that every time a child is hurt, that every time another voice speaks out saying they're part of the Me Too movement, every time war takes another innocent life and something in you dies, there's an explanation that you can point to, that there was a moral law giver. That's just one of the clues. That's the moral clues. Lots of people, that's where their journey began. The second one is clues from the cosmos, which is the big question, what started the universe? Where did it come from? And what I mean by universe is space, time, matter, and energy. And lots of thought over the centuries have gone into this question, what started the universe? Where did we come from? How do we explain this? Because there's a law of causality which says if something is, it has a beginning. If something is, it had a cause. And we know this, right? This building's here, someone built it. Your house is there, someone built it. You drive a car, someone built it. You're here, someone gave birth to you. It's the reality. Everything has a cause. And so lots of people have argued with this over time, and there was this theory called the steady state theory, which is basically the universe is static and it's continually recreating itself over and over again. And so what people would say 100 years ago is that it wasn't God, it was the universe that created everything that we have here today. That's what explains it. That's what we have, and that's how we got here today. And this was a theory that was widely held. Einstein held the steady state theory. It was a regular thing that many people believed. And then all of a sudden, there was this interesting discovery by a man named Edwin Hubble. Such a G, eh? But anyways, Edwin Hubble had this amazing discovery. He's the guy that named the Hubble telescope after. And he had this discovery, and as he was kind of exploring everything in 1929, he discovered the universe isn't static. The universe is actually expanding. It's actually like a balloon, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And what they looked at everything in the universe, and they were actually able to measure the distance between things, and they realized the distance just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It keeps expanding, to which, if you want to blow your mind, think about what's it expanding into, because like, what's out here? It's just crazy, right? Like, nothing. But what's nothing? Like, I try and picture it. Like, is it concrete? Is it like what's there? I don't know, okay? Twice in grade 10 science, I still don't know, okay? But you know what that means? This is the amazing thing. This means that there was no steady state theory. It couldn't be, because everything was moving, which means it had a beginning. Because we know this, energy just can't go on forever. You have a flashlight, eventually the battery will die, the energy will dissipate. And it's like, we've measured this all out, and it's all going, but that means that it had a beginning. That means the universe had a birthday, is what he discovered in 1929. And so they actually did the math. I don't know how the math worked, but they did the math, and most intellectual people would say the universe seems to be about 14 billion years old. Okay? 14 billion years old. So they kind of did that math, they figured that out, and they actually called this the Big Bang Theory. Look at that. I know you guys get nervous every time I get the marker out, right? But that means if it had a beginning, it had something outside of nature, because this is nature. It's expanding into things that aren't nature. So it had something to actually start it. You see, many people actually think that the Big Bang Theory is a nail in the coffin for the Christian faith. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. That actually isn't an end of the discussion. It's actually a really good thing, because here's the really interesting thing that Francis Collins says, who's atheist turned Christian. He was actually the guy that Bill Clinton had to lead the Human Genome Project. And this is what he says: the Big Bang cries out for an explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. I love the way Carey Nieuwhof describes this change in history. He says this. He says the Big Bang didn't take the feet out from under the theologians. It took the feet out from under atheists. There were tons of scientists when the Big Bang Theory first came out who rejected it. Einstein is one of them. Einstein is a person who is on record saying one of the greatest regrets of my life is holding on to steady state theory for so long and not accepting the Big Bang Theory. The Christians, this didn't trip them out. It's like, wait, you mean that scientifically you have proven that the universe didn't exist and then all of a sudden it existed? Really? That doesn't trip up our story at all. That's amazing. You see, it didn't trip up the Christians, it didn't trip up the theologians. It really tripped up the scientists. They had to catch up with it. They had to wait, so it's not this theory that we've held for all these decades. It's another theory. They had to wrestle with it. And so that leads us to this question, which is this: if the universe didn't create us, who or what created the universe? And that's where so many questions come up, and there's so many wrestlings trying to make sense of this. If this is physical, the metaphysical beginning, something that started it all. And you say, well, if there's a God, then who started God? But you have to realize that's outside of space and time, and so that's a metaphysical question to a physical world. It's just hard to get our heads around. And so there's all different kinds of explanations, but science has not ruled out the belief in God, that a supernatural force could have actually done this. In fact, Stephen Hawking, when he's looking at, actually, not yet, I'll get to that in a second, but as they're kind of looking at the odds of what it would take for this to accidentally happen, I think it's, let me see if I get my math right, it's 10 to the 138th power is what it would take. Those are the odds, 1 against 10 to the 138th power, that this could maybe possibly happen. They're still trying to figure it out, okay? Just to let you understand how big a number that is, 10 to the 70th power is the number of cells in the universe. Do you realize how slim the odds are? Let me just draw out 138 zeros for you. No, imagine. That would take forever. But that's how crazy this is. So then in response to this, Stephen Hawking, who's brilliant, look what he says. The odds against a universe like ours are enormous. I think there are religious implications. Is this a slam dunk case? Like, now you know, drop the mic, walk away, you never have to ask another question again? No. But anyone who says, well, how could you ever believe in a supernatural God? You say, I have a lot of reasons and a lot of questions that we need to be wrestling with, because it's not a slam dunk case against it. It is not black and white, as we've often heard. That is so much bigger than we can get our minds around. And there's all different kinds of theories that try and explain it, to which you come back to Scripture. We're going to talk about Scripture in a few weeks, but you kind of get back to Genesis 1. And it talks about the creation of the world. And Romans 1. Let's just go there for a second. Book of Romans chapter 1. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. God is saying, if you look at nature, you just continue. Don't be scared that you're going to discover that I don't exist. As you continue to discover the universe and the vast expanse of it, you just discover how amazing I am. It all points to me. It all leads to me. You don't have to be scared. Next week, we're going to cover science. Didn't science put faith out of business? No, we're going to discover science is actually the garden. It was actually born in the garden of the Christian faith. but that's for next week. But it says all of creation points to it. So then people go back to Genesis 1, and it's like, but doesn't it say that God created the world in 7 days? And so how do we try and figure that out? And people come up well, in the Hebrew, a day could actually be an epoch or a season, so it could have been a long time. It's like, we don't even need to go there. Here's how I would describe that, okay? The scriptures, this is what I like to say, the scriptures show us who created us. And they tell us, as we saw in Romans 1, verse 20, that creation points us to him. The scriptures are there to tell us who created us. Not a play-by-play of everything that happened and what happened with the cells and how it all created. He's just saying it's a narrative to describe to human beings who created the world. It's the same way that I tell my kids all the time, I'm your father, but I don't tell them how I did it. It's just not something I do, right? I just say, I'm your papa, I'm your papa. And then they ask questions, or start to ask questions. How did I get in the tummy, right? And so I said the same thing that many of you have said to your kids. I just say, you were brought to this world in love. That's what I say. And the amazing thing is that our kids years from now are going to dig in a little deeper. And some are going to find out that it started with Marvin Gaye music. Some of them are going to find out that it happened through years and years of fertility treatments and doctors and countless dollars. And other children are going to find out that their parents spent years and years navigating the adoption system and the nightmare that was. And yet every one of them will still say, you were right, you weren't lying, you brought me here in love. That the scriptures show us who created us, and they tell us that creation points us to him. And more as modern science and understanding and intellect and rationale and philosophy wrestle with it, they're starting to discover that faith in God is not a stick your head in the sand and that's why you believe it, but it is actually a very healthy intellectual position. So where does that leave us for today? Immanuel Kant, 250 years ago, said, the starry heavens above me, the universe, and the moral law within me are the two strongest arguments. But there's so much more to this conversation. But after our first day together, here's what I want to say is, number one, if you came at an invitation, someone invited you, you've never been to church or haven't been to church in decades, can I just say thank you? Thank you for coming. Thanks for reading the one-star review. Thanks for wrestling with questions. Thanks for questioning your doubts, being skeptical about your skepticism. We're all on a journey and we want to find the truth. And I just want to honor that. Just think that's so fantastic that you did that. Keep following the evidence where it leads, not where we hope it leads. And that goes for the Jesus people as well. And Lakeside is an amazing community, and Alpha especially, if I can encourage you. Those nights where you get dinner and a group to discuss and those amazing videos that just prompt you to think about bigger things beyond mortgage payments and child rearing and career and all that stuff. It's just an amazing time to wrestle with our purpose in life and how did we get here. And so I just encourage you that for the Jesus people in the room, can we not be scared? Can we not be scared? Because as we wrestle with God, it builds intimacy. We see that in Scripture. As people wrestle with him, as they ask questions, as they get in the mud with him, it builds intimacy. Can we just agree that it is okay to ask questions? Parents in the room, grandparents in the room, let's not use the terms just have more faith or you just got to believe. Because our kids have questions, our young adults have questions. There are people who are not in the room who should be in the room and they have questions. Let's open up our dinner times and our dinner tables to wrestle. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say, I'll look into that, but let's be a community that is continually fostering questions. And not sidelining people. There's some of you that are in the room and you're the one-star review Christian. You know what I mean? You're the one that was always in the small group and you're always like, hey, but what about the dinosaurs? How do we explain that? And what about the scriptures in that section is that feels like a contradiction? And you're always asking those questions and you just felt like the church wasn't for you because people were like, you just lack faith. I'm so sorry. You're actually a gift. 1 Peter, it talks about how we're always supposed to be ready to give a defense for our faith, to understand why we believe. And so I just want to re-welcome you into our community of faith and say, this is a place for you. You may have had questions, you may have had doubts. So do the people that follow Jesus. You're so welcome here. Let's be people who dig deep because we discover who our Creator is. Romans 1:20 tells us the more we look into creation, the more we understand who He is, not the less. that as you go for a walk today, enjoy the fall breeze and the beautiful sunshine, that you pick up each blade of grass and you look at the intrinsic detail that is in it and you allow it to point you to worship. And your Creator, as you see children running around, you just think, wow, wow. Would you just stand? I just want to pray and bless you as you go today. End on a little bit of a different note. God, we want to be the kind of church that is so open to questions, so open to wrestlings. Lord, we pray for the day where we have to move Alpha to a bigger room because there's just so many people who are wrestling with questions. Lord, would you just even open our eyes to the people in our workspaces, our schools, our communities who we can invite into this dialogue, because we're just a community that wants to follow where the evidence leads. We want to help more and more people understand who you are. You're such a good Father. We love you. We want to learn more about you through this journey. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to bless you as you go. Remind you, our prayer teams, they're coming up to the front. If you need prayer for anything, they're going to be up here. And Alpha signups and small group signups are at the Next Steps booth. We'll see you next week. Have a great week, Lakeside.